evening, everyone. Welcome to Washington State Ferries public meeting for the Point Defiance, Tahlequah, and Fauntleroy, Vashon, Southworth routes. We hold these public meetings twice a year to hear about issues that are important to you and to provide updates on ferry service. This is the 6th meeting that we've been holding this series, and I'm glad you've joined us. My name is Hadley Rodero. I'm with the Washington State Ferries outreach team, and I'll be your moderator this evening. We will be starting off with a brief presentation, and then most of the meeting will be reserved to take your questions and comments. So before we get started, let's talk about how you'll be able to participate today. All attendees are on mute, and you will find the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and that's how you'll be able to submit questions for our panel of WSF executives to answer. We'll be taking all questions through the Q&A box, other than those joining by phone, who can participate in the Q&A session by pressing *9, which will allow you to raise your hand, and we'll call on you toward the end of the meeting, and you can ask your question verbally. We will only call on raised hands associated with a phone number or a call-in participant. All other questions will be read aloud for our project team to respond to. You may click on the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen as well, which will activate closed captions if you find that helpful during the meeting. We're going to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If we have multiple questions on a single topic, I may combine the questions, so don't worry if you don't hear your exact question read aloud. That's why. We're reading everything that comes in, and we'll be sharing all the feedback and the questions and comments with other staff members. So rest assured that we're seeing your question, even if we don't get to it, or if we need to combine it with someone else's. Please submit your questions anytime during the presentation. You can put them in, or you can wait till after the presentation and then submit them. If you're having technical difficulties, please put a message in the Q&A, and we'll have someone reach out and help you with those. You also can send longer comments or anything that occurs to you after the meeting to our email, which is wsfcoms@washdot.wa.gov. That's wsfcoms@wsdot.wa.gov. We'll be posting a video recording of this meeting on the WSF website tomorrow. You'll also find recordings of all our other 5 public meetings there if you're curious to hear what we heard from other routes. So on the screen, you'll see the directors who are with us today, and these are the folks who will be available for questions at the end of the meeting. We have with us Patty Robstello, WSF's Assistant Secretary, who's the head of Washington State Ferries, Nicole McIntosh, Chief of Staff, John Vizina, Director of Planning, Customer, and Government Relations, Todd Lemfier, Director of Finance and Administration, David Sowers, Director of Terminal Engineering, and Steve Nevy, Director of Marine Operations. So you can direct your questions to any of these folks during the meeting. And we're going to reserve most of the time at the end to take those questions. I know you all can't see who we have in the room with us today. We have about 70 participants, which is a great turnout. And I'm going to launch a quick poll to find out where you're joining us from. So you'll see on the screen, which community are you from? Are you from Fauntleroy, West Seattle, Vashon, Southworth, Port Orchard, South Kitsap County area, Tacoma, Point Defiance area, or somewhere else? I'll give you a chance to put in your answer, and then I will share the results so you can see who's in the meeting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'll share the results. So the vast majority of participants, 71%, are from Vashon Island. Welcome. Number of folks from Fauntleroy, West Seattle, 16%. And about 10% from the other side of the route, Southworth, Port Orchard, South Kitsap County, and a few folks from somewhere else. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to launch a poll to find out, how often do you ride the ferry? Do you ride regularly, 4 to 5 days a week, occasionally, just a few times a month, rarely, once a month or once every few months, or do you not ride the ferry? Looks like nearly everyone has answered the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So a good mix, 38% ride nearly every day, 45% occasionally, few times a month, and 17% rarely, once a month or once every few months. So thanks for that. Now we're going to dive right into the meeting, and I'm going to ask Patty to come on, who will start off our presentation.
Hey, thanks, Hadley, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a warm but a beautiful spring evening, and you chose to spend it with us, so thank you for making the time. We hold these system-wide community meetings twice a year in coordination with our ferry advisory committees to hear from you, our customers, and our community members, and also to share the latest information with you. I first want to take a few minutes to explain the role of the ferry advisory committees, especially for any of you who are new to these meetings. There are 13 ferry advisory committees who members by state statute are appointed by their respected counties to advise Washington State Ferries on issues affecting our passengers. The ferry advisory committees do a really good job of relaying information to us and asking questions that really represent the concerns of their communities. We'll be hearing some of their questions during the Q&A session tonight, and at the very end of the meeting, we'll share with you how you can get in contact with your local ferry advisory committee chair. And I want to thank all of our ferry advisory committee members who volunteer their time to do this important engagement and really appreciate everything that they do. Now, even though today's meetings focus on the communities and passengers using the Triangle route as well as Point Defiance Tahlequah route, I still wanted to share this graphic on the screen just to show how diverse our entire system is and how many other communities we serve. Now, to start things off, I wanted to explain the purpose behind our presentation today. We have two major topics that we will be discussing this evening. One is to share the latest update on our projects, our constraints, and service restoration progress. And the second is to give an overview of the fare setting process and to get your input on the three options that Washington State Ferries is studying. One of these options will be what the agency will present to the Transportation Commission in June as our recommendation. And we do have some commissioners a part of this meeting tonight listening to your questions and your input. Our ferry service has not fully recovered to full capacity, and later you'll hear why that is and why that is the case and what we're doing to restore full service. But before we launch into that, I wanted to start by sharing with you some of our stats from the first 4 months of this year. I'm not going to read each and every one of these, but in the first 4 months, we served over 5.2 million total users, almost equally split between car and driver, and then the rest of the passengers and walk-ons. Our trip reliability was just over 98%, and we recognize that's for the entire system. We know we have challenges and issues with specific routes in the system. We had 22 life-saving events, 723 medical priority loadings, and 146 whale sightings. Let's look more at the ridership. A quick orientation to this chart. 2019 is the green line that's at the top of the chart. Light gray is at the bottom, and that represents 2020. And then the last 3 years are in the middle, this year being represented in orange. You can see ridership continues to grow, but not fully across the system. We're seeing near pre-pandemic levels on some routes, but not everywhere. Walk-ons continue to increase, but it's clear that we are not fully back to pre-pandemic levels, and it's probably going to take several years before we get there. To provide a route-specific comparison of the first 4 months of this year to the same 4 months in 2019, the Triangle route is still down by 27%. However, the Point Defiance Tahlequah route is actually up by 4%. Now, next, I want to share a brief update on one of our most important initiatives, system-wide electrification. We're embarking on a very ambitious initiative to transition to an emission-free fleet through hybrid electric ferry system. Washington State's ferries is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions of any state agency here in Washington State. We burn 19 million gallons of fuel each and every year. This shift to hybrid electric ferries is in response to the governor and the legislator's direction, as well as alignment with the agency's own long-range plan initiatives. To transition to a hybrid electric fleet, Washington State Ferries is working on 3 key elements of the electrification system. We're building new vessels, we're converting existing vessels, and we're electrifying our terminals. We're excited that next year we should have our first converted Jumbo Mark II, which will be the Wenatchee. And in 2027, we expect to have our first new hybrid electric vessel delivered. Now I'd like to switch gears. Crew and vessel availability remains our biggest challenge to maintaining reliable service and to restore service system-wide. We're still short a number of employees we need to operate full, reliable service, especially for licensed deck officers, which take many years to develop and train. We currently have 200 licensed deck officers, or we need, 200 licensed deck officers to provide reliable operations on all routes. Currently, we have almost 170 licensed deck officers able to work in the fleet as captains and mates. The number fluctuates due to leave, retirements, attrition, and the number of employees completing training programs. Now, according to a 2022 study commissioned by the legislature, 81 licensed deck officers will be eligible to retire between now and 2027. That means we need to have 100 new licensed deck officers by 2027. The path to becoming a licensed deck officer, which you'll see on the left, or to be a licensed chief engineer, which is on the right, is quite long. It takes a lot of time for them to progress from kind of entry level all the way up to those credentialed licensed positions. I know the detail on this graphic may be hard to read, but they show that the career path that is really, it's to meet US Coast Guard requirements. And it's a combination of the amount of sea time they have and the training that's necessary to get those credentials. Workforce development is one of our top priorities here at Washington State Ferries, and we've created several new programs to assist our staff to advance in those career paths. We continue to be grateful for the support and the funding from the legislature and the governor to implement these new programs. One of these programs to develop new licensed deck officers is the new AB to Mate program, made up of 3 steps to bring employees from unlicensed officer to have their mate's credentials. Since early last year, we have had 27 complete one of the AB to Mate credentialing programs. Step 1, which is the AB to Mate credential program. 11 have completed step 2, which is the pilotage program. And then 29 have completed step 3, which is new mate orientation. We just recently launched a new campaign to make more people aware of the jobs we have here at Washington State Ferries. We've revamped how we hire for certain key positions and adjusted our hiring practices to bring people in year-round rather than only ahead of the summer peak season. Now let's talk about vessel availability. As you saw at the start of my presentation, we only have 21 vessels in our fleet, and our long-range plan calls for 26. In order to maintain our existing vessels, we need to take 2 vessels out of service during the peak season, 4 vessels out during the off-peak season just for planned maintenance. We need 19 vessels to operate normal summer service and 17 to operate normal winter service. Now let's touch on the fact that the 3 vessels on the screen are nearing retirement. The Tahlequah should be retired this year, the Kaliton in 2026, and the Yakima in 2027. So let's do a little math here. If we have 21 existing vessels and we minus 3 soon to be retired boats, and then we minus 2 to 4 out of just planned maintenance, what my math shows is we would have 14 to 16 vessels available for service when we really need 17 to 19, depending on the season. The numbers don't factor in any unplanned breakdowns, which, as we all know, do occur. So the conclusion to this math exercise is that it's clear that we need to extend the life of these older vessels until the new hybrid electric vessels are delivered in order to provide full service. And again, we thank the governor and the legislature who have provided the funding necessary for this critical work. Now I'd like to turn it over to Todd Lamphere, who will be giving a brief budget update and presenting the tariff information. Todd, please take it away.
Thanks, Patty, for that presentation. So I'm going to talk to you today about 2 topics, as Patty mentioned. We're going to talk briefly about the budget that the legislature recently passed. We're also going to talk about the ferry fare development process. So beginning with the budget, as you can see on the screen in front of you, The legislature provided us about $1.2 billion to operate the ferry system. That includes both operating and capital. That can be a little bit confusing, so I'll kind of try to explain that. The operating, that $740 million, it's exactly for what it sounds like. It provides for some of the labor costs, some fuel costs, things necessary to operate the system is really what that includes. On the capital side, that's where it's a little confusing. That's where we usually repair and build things. So things like new vessel construction, things like repairing some of the dolphins and terminals and such like that. So $533 million was provided for that. An example of some things that's included inside of each of those. Inside the operating budget, we received funding from the legislature for deck operations and workforce development. Things that Patty talked about, like the Able-Bodied to Mate Pathway Program, New Mate Scholarship Program, Training for New Hires Program. These are very important as we sustainably try to restore our service. And thankfully, the legislature and the governor supported that and provided funding for that program. In the engine room, we also received more funding to hire more engine room wipers, which is kind of that entry-level class where we start to bring folks in to also provide a pipeline of folks that could work in our engine room. We're also really excited about a second shift at Eagle Harbor that gives us another shift worth of maintenance that can occur on our terminals and vessels. As we know, our boats are aging as well as our terminals. In the capital budget, 3 key areas. There's many others, but I wanted to highlight three areas. There's additional funding provided for the electrification program, increased funding for terminal and vessel preservation. Sorry about that. And we're also excited about some additional funding that was provided for ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act funding, to better improve the service for this population at our terminals and vessels. So we're excited about that. Next, I want to move over to ferry fare development process and what we're considering. This slide talks about our process that is used to develop our fare increases usually. Washington State Ferries develops fare proposals with input from ferry users, a group called the FACT, or the Ferry Advisory Committee on Tariffs. This group is made up of the chairs of each ferry advisory committee, as well as other reps. This is the stage that we're at. We're listening to input. Then Washington State Ferries submits its fare proposal to the Washington State Transportation Commission, which is actually responsible for setting the ferry fares. This year, we make our presentation to the Transportation Commission on June 21st at their meeting in Friday Harbor. The Washington State Transportation Commission can choose to adopt Washington State Ferries proposal, or they can adopt another one of their own. So before we move on, I want to allow the Transportation Commission members who are joining us tonight, as well as Transportation Commission staff, to turn on their cameras and introduce themselves. They are here, they're listening to your questions and comments and taking those into consideration as we go through this process. Hadley?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. So let's just start with Commissioner Restucci.
Good evening, Jim Restucci, Commissioner from Yakima County. Great to be here this evening. Looking forward to the question and answer. Thank you.
Great, and Commissioner Jennings.
Roy Jennings from Clark County, glad to be here and listening in. Thank you.
Thank you. And Transportation Commission staff, Rima Griffith.
Hi, good evening. I'm Rima Griffith. I'm the Executive Director located in Olympia. Thanks.
Thanks, and Aaron Halbert.
Good evening, everyone. Aaron Halbert, Financial Analyst with the Commission staff. Thanks for having us.
Great, and thank you for being here and listening to all the comments.
Thank you, Hadley. Thank you, Transportation Commissioners and Commission staff. The Transportation Commission is hosting an online public comment forum collecting input on options that they're considering. We're going to put the link in the chat, and I encourage you to read through all the information and share your thoughts with them too. You'll be able to do so at the link that'll be provided just momentarily. So now we're going to move into the legislative funding target that was set by the legislature. As you can see on the slide, the 2023 to 25 legislative conference budget assumed a 4% fare increase for the ferry system. The revenue funding target associated with a 4% fare increase is approximately $419 million for the 2023-25 biennium. In plain English, that's the next 2 years starting in July. So how do we get there? There's many ways we can get there, but historically we've used two. Those two approaches are a differential and a non-differential fare setting process. Differential is exactly what it sounds like. We apply the increase differently between passengers and vehicles. The non-differential fare setting process applies them equally between passengers and vehicles. Our next slides, we'll talk about 3 options. 2 are on this slide because the third is fairly complex, and I wanted to show that to you differently so that we can focus on that one as you understand all 3. This is just a summary slide of the first 2. One is a differential and a non-differential, and we'll get into both of those in just a moment. So option 1 is a 4% increase for passenger fares on October 1st, 2023 and October 1st, 2024. And I just thought I should pause and just let you know that at the very end of all 3 options, we're going to show you a summary slide of all 3. Hadley's going to bring up a poll and she's going to ask you to vote for your preference for these 3 options. And it'll be option 1, option 2, or option 3. So I'm going to try to move through the information clearly and succinctly so that you're able to make an informed vote toward the end. So back to the presentation here, option 1 is that non-differential fare increase. Probably of most importance is what does it do for your particular fares? So we'll pick just a few here. Option 1 would raise the fares 4% equally for the first and the second year. You only see the first represented here just to kind of show, make it a little easier on the comparison. So if we pick the top one, full passenger fare for the Point Defiance to Tahlequah Triangle route, it would go from $6.25 to $6.45, up 20 cents. You have to take into account tariff route equity and nickel rounding, which we apply here. So we can pick, maybe we'll go to the bottom, standard vehicle 14 to 22 peak, Fauntleroy to Southworth, $16.55 up to $17.20, which increases about 65 cents. You can see there's a range, there's a $1 increase just above that, but you can pick the routes that you ride most and see what the impact would be if we chose a non-differential fare as in option 1. Option 2 is the differential fare. Again, the differential fare treats passengers and vehicles differently. So what you see here is a 3.5% increase for passenger fares and a 4.5% increase for vehicle fares. These both would go into effect, an increase on October 1st, and then another increase on October 1st, 2024. So what that looks like for your route, once again, this is only for the first year. There would be another increase in the second year. Full passenger fare for the Point Defiance Tahlequah Triangle route would go for $6.25 up to $6.40, or an increase of 15%. We picked that same route down below. Standard vehicle 14 to 22 feet peak, Fauntleroy to Southworth, goes from $16.55 to $17.30 for 75 cents. And you can see right above that there's another one for $1.20. You can see here, compared to the last one, the vehicle fares do go up more because they're 4.5% versus 3.5%. So now I'm going to transition to option 3, which is complex. I'm going to ask you to kind of just stick with me here. I'm going to walk you through the explanation. I'm going to give you a slide that tries to show you the model and then what it looks like in terms of increases for your particular fares. So the FACT discussion suggested decreasing the burden for our most frequent riders who purchase multi-ride passes. So we came up with option 3. Essentially, this option increases multi-ride passes less than standard vehicle and passenger fares for the first and the second year. Vehicle and passenger fares would increase by 4.25% each year, October 1st, 2023 and 2024. Multi-ride passes would increase by about 2.7% year 1 and about 4% on year 2, as these are tied to the base fare, which I'll explain in just a moment. I want to be clear that in options 1 and option 2, multi-ride fares would increase by the same percentages as the standard vehicle and passenger fares. I know it's a bit confusing, so we'll show you a kind of an explanation or an example here. So this graphic shows the steps to calculate the multi-ride fare for vehicles. Take the vehicle fare, that's the top line, multiply that fare times 20 for the equivalent of 20 passes, And then for the multi-ride fares, we apply a frequent rider discount, which is currently 20%. We then add the amount for the capital surcharge, and then we come up with the multi-ride fare. To keep the linkage between the regular fare and the multi-ride fare, the best way to achieve a lower increase is to just increase the discount. So if you look at this next slide, you'll see that if regular vehicle fares increase by 4.25%, as we mentioned on the regular fare increase, we would multiply that by 20 passes. And then to get that lower increase, we increase the discount to 21%. So you see that there's a discount applied for 21% there. Add the capital surcharge, and that's where we get the fare would increase by 2.7% in the first year, and then roughly 4% in the second year. So in application, what does that look like? For this particular route, let's pick the similar routes there. Full passenger fare, Point Defiance, Tahlequah Triangle route, $6.25 goes to $6.50, or a 25% increase. Jumping down to the bottom here, we have the standard vehicle, the same one we used there, 14 to 22 foot peak Fauntleroy to Southworth, $16.55 to $17.25, or a 70-cent increase. And I think the next slide has our multi-ride passes on there. So the first passenger multi-ride currently is $51. With that lower increase than the vehicles and passengers on the previous slide, it would go up by $1.40 in this scenario in year one. Year two is not listed here. That would go up by roughly 4%. And but this first one would go up by $1.40 on that first one. And if we jump down to the bottom, standard vehicle, 14 to 22 feet multi-ride, Fauntleroy to Southworth, $215.60 would go up $6.10 to $221.70 there. So in summary, and once again, remember, this is where we're looking you to weigh and look at each of the options, and Hadley's going to bring up a poll in just a moment. But in summary, Washington State Ferries is looking at all three of these options to meet the revenue target that we talked about on the slide earlier. We are looking for your input tonight, and it will be used in the recommendation that we talked about that we plan to make to the commission on the 21st. So option one would raise both vehicle and passenger fares by 4% on October 1st, 2023 and October 1st, 2024, the non-differential fare. Option two was to raise standard vehicle fares by 4.5% and passenger fares by 3.5% on October 1st, 2023, and then again on October 1st, 2024. That's the differential fare. And the one that was a little complex that we just got done talking about is to increase the rate for multi-ride passes at a lower rate than standard vehicle and passenger fares for the first and the second year. This option would raise vehicle and passenger fares by 4.25% and multi-ride passes by approximately 2.7% in October 1st, 2023, and about 4% on October 1st, 2024. So at this point, I'm going to ask Hadley to come on, and we're going to show you this screen here and then ask you to vote for which one you would choose. Hadley?
Yeah, Todd, before we do that, 2 slides ago, you showed a ferry fares chart, and there's a question that I think is a good one. What does OW and RT mean on your chart? I believe it's one way and round trip. Is that correct?
That is exactly that. And let's go back to those 2 slides just so that we can have folks take a look at that one more time so they know what they're voting on. Great question, and sorry I should have put that on there. If we go back one more slide, you will see RT is round trip and OW is one way. I don't think it was on the next slide, but just leaving that up there just for a brief moment. That's what that means. And thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay.
Let's go to the slide with the poll. And just so we all know, before I launch the poll, we're going to ask, what is your preference of the 3 options that Todd just discussed to meet the target set by the legislature for revenue? So I have the poll up. Option 1 is raise both vehicle and passenger fares by the same amount. Option 2 is raise vehicle fares by a higher amount than passenger fares. And option 3 is to increase the discount for multi-ride passes. I'll leave this open for just a moment to give you a chance. I know that sort of options are somewhat complicated, to give you a chance to read them. So if you had to choose one of these options for Todd and his team to consider and present to the legislature, to the Transportation Commission as a recommendation, which would you choose? It looks like nearly everyone has voted now, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So Todd, it looks like the majority, 64%, prefer option 3. Just about 20% prefer option 2, and close to that is 17% prefer option 1.
Thank you, Hadley, and thank you to those who voted and are listening to this. As I just want to remind you that we make our recommendation on the 21st to the commission. The commissioners are here. You've met them. They're listening. So this and all input is considered. So I appreciate your time and your input.
Thank you. Okay, so now David Sowers is going to talk about the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal project.
Yeah, thanks, Hadley. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about projects. As many of you are aware of, we've been spending some time here the last few years studying and starting the environmental process to replace the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal. The terminal itself is seismically deficient and structurally deficient. Over the years, the wear and tear on this 70-year-old structure has taken place, and it's, as you can see from the photos, it's not only sits pretty low in the water and is impacted by sea level rise, it's also operationally challenging as it's an 84-car dock that feeds 124-car class vessels. So we've been working closely with the community on the project. We've come up with 2 alternatives to replace the facility. One is essentially to replace it in kind in the current footprint, and the other option is to replace it with a larger facility that has more holding capacity and can address some of those operational challenges. So WSF is working closely with advisory groups. These are both technical advisory groups that are composed of stakeholders and the tribes, as well as our community advisory groups, and get their input on the approaches that we want to take to replace the facility. One of the things that we're working on right now is confirming the regulatory and permitting requirements that are needed for this facility, regardless of its size and what those potential impacts are. I just wanted to highlight this coming week. We will have a boat in the water taking a look underneath the dock and using video survey to map the amount of eelgrass that's underneath and around the existing terminal, as well as do a microalgae evaluation. So you will see some activity out there, which is all part of this project for a couple of days next week. We're also analyzing the traffic situation. I noticed in the chat questions about how we're managing traffic at the intersection with Fauntleroy. So that's something that we're looking at in this study, as well as looking at obviously the cost of constructing these different alternatives, how we can provide better connectivity for bicyclists and folks walking on and van pools and car pools. And then one of the things that the community's weighed in strongly is just to have us take a look at how Good to Go, which is a ticketing system that we use throughout the state, could be implemented on this route, or other forms of advanced ticketing to help again streamline and improve processing through the facility, and all in the intent here to improve the experience and efficiency of the operation. So those are some of the things we're working on. I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period when we get to that. With that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, David. So last year, as people started to return to regular ridership, and ridership, as Patty discussed, is still down, but more and more people started to travel, we looked at our capacity to restore service. And what we saw, given our crewing levels, the people we lost during the pandemic through retirements, the vaccine mandate, and just regular attrition, and a global shortage of mariners. I read an interesting article yesterday that talked about ferry systems across the world who are struggling to find mariners. as what we often refer to as the silver tsunami that we've been talking to the public and legislators and the governor's office about several years, as those people, the mariners who we relied on, started to retire. As we looked across the system, we realized that we could not restore every route to 100% service and reliability all at once. That if we waited until we had the capacity to do that, it would be years for every route. So as every organization does when they have constrained resources, we looked at what we were able to do, and then we developed a prioritization for returning service. As you'll see on your screen, we prioritized routes. We looked at ridership, alternate travel options, vessel availability. Part of that is not every vessel works at every terminal. And then we came up with the prioritization. So as we have the staffing that we think we can restore a route reliably, we do that. We do a 3-week trial. And when that is successful, and it's important that our crewing is done on 2-week cycles, and the second week is often tight when people have already gotten their hours. But when we can reliably restore service, we call that route restored, and then we look for those metrics to see when we can restore service on the next route. This is a very inexact science. I wouldn't even call it a science. There are a couple of things happening. One, we don't control when people retire, when they leave for other reasons, move out of state, just decide that they no longer want to work with us. And we also don't control the pace at which they go through their training. So as Patty described earlier, our biggest constraint right now is licensed deck officers. And they have to go through those 3 steps Patty described, and it takes months, and people do it at their own pace. So, we trial service, and then we restore service as we can. Just before we go to the next slide, Bryn, I want to be very direct with you folks, because I talk to a lot of you. I certainly talk to the governor's office about you, to your legislators, to your local elected officials. Senator Wynn and Representatives Alvarado and Fitzgibbon are very engaged. They're very direct with us about their frustrations about your service levels. We know that as islanders, you rely on our service to get to work, to get to medical appointments, to get to essential travel, or just to get to a Seahawks or Mariners game. And that for the last 2 years, our service levels have meant that that is much more challenging. And when you can travel, that you have to wait in long lines. Everyone that you will see on screen in a few minutes answering your questions, we get it, we know, and we're doing everything we can every day to restore service, to do the hiring and the crewing that we need to do that. But with Coast Guard crewing requirements, if safety is the Coast Guard's and our #1 priority all the time, that's not always a quick fix. In fact, it won't be a quick fix. So, as we do these priorities, then the next step is the routes that we have restored. So as you see, we've restored the first 4 routes on our prioritization list. And in February, when we were looking at what we thought we would be able to do, again, we have to predict how many crew members will complete trainings, especially those licensed deck officers, get credentials, but how many people also are going to retire. At that time in February, we thought we could restore 3-boat service on the Triangle in April or May at the latest. But then as that approached and we looked at the numbers we had, we were basically treading water. We weren't gaining as many of those folks because of the reasons I just explained than we thought we had. And we realized we wouldn't be able to restore that, and it would likely be the summer before we could. Before these meetings, we had a similar conversation with Bremerton last night. Before these meetings, we did another look, and it now looks unlikely that we will be able to restore to trial restoration on the Triangle route until early next year. We have a class of licensed deck officers finishing at the end of this year, and that should give us enough crewing to be able to crew a 3rd boat. A couple of other things here. Again, we understand the significant shortfalls in service that you all are experiencing, and we're doing what we can. We, unlike other ferry systems, cruise lines, we talk to our colleagues at BC Ferries. They are struggling with the same issues, but they can hire people from around the world. Because of US federal law, we can only hire Americans or resident aliens and permanent residents. And that severely constricts the number of people we can hire. So we are doing our best to move people up, but it's taking time. And I understand when you're waiting on a dock, that is time that you don't have, and it's incredibly frustrating. Just another couple of things before I go into something that we hope you will participate in and give us some feedback. So let's talk about this week, and when we talk about vessel availability. On Monday night, the Walla Walla, which on April 15th ran aground, its engine room crew told us that they were seeing some of the same issues and they were concerned. And their recommendation was the boat immediately be taken out of service. Because Bremerton's on one boat service, taking it out would have meant closing that route altogether. So with just a couple of hours notice or less, we moved the Chimacum over from the Seattle Bainbridge route. We had the Issaquah as a service relief vessel. We moved that to Bainbridge, and that allowed us to keep those routes open. But we already had a plan for a boat we have to take out for maintenance in the San Juans to move the Issaquah. So that meant with no other vessels available, we had to take this, the Cathlamet from your route, putting the Self into service. I know both from the phone calls I get, a text exchange I had with one of your neighbors this evening, how maddening it is to be on two boat service and then to also be downsized. It looks like the Walla Walla will be out for 2 weeks as soon as it is repaired and safe to put back into service. And you know, service restoration is our number 2 priority because number 1 is always safety. But as soon as we're able to put that back in service, we will get the Cathlamet back to you as soon as we can crew that boat move and get you back to at least increased capacity. It's just an example of where we are, and not just crewing, but also vessel availability, as we have 21 boats now, as Patty was describing, instead of the 24 we had a couple of years ago. So knowing that the impact on you all of not restoring 3-boat service until early next year, we looked at other possibilities. And I know as you're at home and you've had a lot of us talking at you for the last 40 minutes, and you know, you have your children and spouses and TV, but I hope you'll really listen to this part because we're going to ask you for some feedback. There are times, as you know, that we have a 3rd vessel tied up at the Triangle. It's there mostly in case we have to take a boat out, so it's there and ready. But there are some times that it's there, and we think we will be able to crew it sometimes. Not every day by far, but when we have a boat there and we have the crewing available, we're thinking about doing something we haven't ever tried before, and that's putting it into service as an unscheduled boat to do cleanup on the route. So, you know, the 2-boat service, obviously it falls behind, and we've heard loud and clear that you want that boat to be on time. You know, our reliability metrics, if you look on our website, reliability means that a sailing actually goes. In our language, on-time performance is a separate metric. So the sailings are going, but we know if you can't get home in a timely manner and rely on them, it doesn't feel that way. So with an eye toward improving on-time performance, we're thinking about, and again, we're going to ask you to get some feedback. So here are some of the complications. The 2- and 3-boat schedules are very different. And nobody we've talked to thinks it's a good idea to try to alternate day to day or hour to hour between the two. It's too confusing. So what we would do is, again, on the occasions when we have a 3rd boat available and we have crewing for that boat, we would put it into service, hopefully filling some of the gaps we all know about that you all explained to us. And it would just go in, slotting in between the 2 boats that are on a schedule. It's important to note, and you'll see this in the list of questions. What we want to know from you is it better to keep the 2-boat schedule? It's frustrating, it's not always on time, but at least you know it. Or should we add a 3rd unscheduled and unannounced boat? We would just do it when we could. So while it would add additional service, and we really believe it would help the other 2 boats keep on schedule, you may get to Fauntleroy and be expecting to go directly to Vashon, but that boat may be going to Southworth first. So you may get on a Vashon boat and get home more quickly. You may, though, be put on a boat because the size of that dock, we can't stage and let people choose which destination they want to go to. You may see a boat as we work to get a boat in to keep it on schedule or to get it back on schedule. You may see a boat leave not completely full. You may be on an earlier sailing, waiting offshore for a boat to go. And then you'll see the last bullet. You may be loaded on an earlier sailing, but stopped at a different terminal on the way to your destination. So we are trying to think outside the box. We understand and apologize for your current level of service. We understand how frustrating it is. For all the reasons I and Patty and others have explained, because we can't sail without the crewing the Coast Guard requires, crewing we don't currently have, we are wondering if this would be an acceptable solution, or frustrating though it is, you'd rather stick to 2-boat service. Before I finish and turn it back over to Hadley, I do want to I mentioned the legislators on your route. There are 30 ferry legislators, so yours are a 10th of that. They're representing, Vashon, that has 3 of the current 15 boats in service, so 20%, and Southworth, which has 2. They talk to us all the time. They fight in that ferry caucus for your priorities. They are not, we are not immune from their frustration. They have provided funds working with the governor to correct this. We have new programs that Patty described that are helping us build back, but none of that is happening as quickly as we would like, because again, safety is our first priority. So with that, Hadley, do you have any questions before we do the poll?
Yeah, John, before we take the poll, we have a number of questions or comments in the chat asking if you've considered modifying the 2-boat schedule instead of this, or in addition to this proposal. Is there any way to change the 2-boat schedule?
That's a great question, and thank you. I should have addressed that. We have a planning staff of 2. We are funded by the legislature for certain positions and certain levels of service, and there are competing transportation needs all across the state. So we have a planning staff of 2. They are already overwhelmed with the work they're doing, just keeping up with service restoration, preparing schedules for each season. They're some of the busiest people on my team, a team of overachievers working late hours every day. So we do not have the internal capacity to adjust the 2-boat schedule. That takes not only time, but a lot of public engagement. And, while we all believe it's a reasonable request, it's just something we don't have the capacity to do.
Okay, and Steve has joined us as well. He's Director of Marine Operations to help clarify this before we run the poll. Steve, what are some of the challenges that throw the 2-boat schedule off schedule, the current 2 boats? How do they get off schedule today?
There's several challenges. There's several times in the day where the staff have to back big rig trucks onto the ferry at Vashon. That puts the vessel behind, and then it stays behind for the rest of the day. And then if there's any medical emergencies where we have to take a boat out of service to do a direct shot for an ambulance or a medical emergency, then it's really hard to then catch up and get back on schedule.
Okay, and Steve and John, question here about, would there be another option to do this 3rd random boat, as it says in this comment, but with better information? And the comment is people can know what the boats are going to be doing. That would be a more acceptable option. Have you thought about doing this in a way that you could notify people what that 3rd boat's doing?
The second, I think the point to understand is that the 2 boats would carry on their current schedule. The 3rd boat would be random, and by the way it operates, it would relieve those bottlenecks and gaps in the schedule. So the other 2 boats would remain on schedule more reliably while the 3rd boat's running cleanup. But the decisions are going to be made by the captains and the terminal supervisors where they see the most need. So it's going to be really difficult to communicate that. But if you show up to take the 3 o'clock scheduled service and you show up at 2:15, there's a chance that you might get taken at 2:30 on the random boat, if we're going to call it the random, and get to where you're going earlier. Like that's the idea. But to just flip from a 3-boat schedule to a 2-boat schedule is just unmanageable. There's no way to do it efficiently, both for passengers or for crew.
Yeah, I think that's what's key. We obviously, we would love to be able to say, okay, for these hours or this day, you're on a 3-boat. But, you know, as you know, from cancellations that you deal with, we don't control who shows up every day. So, you know, they get in a car accident or they have a sick child and they have a last-minute relief request. And Steve's team does an unbelievable job in filling relief requests. He and I are texting nearly every night, worried about routes shutting down. And 98% of the time, the dispatchers pull it out and find someone to work. But we think it would be much more confusing to customers to say, you know, okay, we're dropping a 3rd boat in, now we're on a 3-boat schedule. And then at the end of that shift, okay, now we're going back to a 2-boat schedule. It won't work. And so this is, you know, looking cross-departmentally at options to help doing what we can during this difficult time. This is what we came up with.
So just to kind of clarify this even further, because we have some questions in the chat, would it be possible to go with this dynamic deployment of the available ferries and crews, so unscheduled, unannounced, and post timely updates on the WSF website that shows the sailing status of all 3 ferries?
From what we've discussed, I know this is challenging and it's not perfect, but our goal is to make the 2-boat schedule more reliable, and as Steve said, fill gaps. That 3rd boat will just be, you know, dropping in and clearing people off and moving to try to help those boats stay on schedule. So its schedule will be too dynamic to keep track of. You could look at Vessel Watch, I think, but for our staff to be trying to monitor where it goes and what it's doing, I think would just not only be frustrating for staff who've already, you know, pretty challenged with their workloads, but also for customers trying to keep up. You know, one of the things we hear is that, you know, complaints about too many passenger alerts. If we were constantly trying to tell you, you know, the South is now here, now it's moving there, I just don't think it works.
Okay,
I
well,
think the key message is to plan for the 2-boat schedule, and there's a chance that you'll get an earlier boat with the 3-boat, and the 2-boat schedule will be more reliably on time. And one of the other things to kind of explain is that the direction to the captains and the terminal supervisors will be that there's no way that the 3rd boat can get in the way of the 2-boat schedule. So if the boat that's on schedule is coming into the dock, you need to be the 3rd boat needs to be out of the way so that the 2-boat schedule can keep its schedule.
okay, well,
Go ahead.
sorry. I was just gonna say, I think we've kind of come to the point where we should run the poll. We've addressed some of the urgent questions here, and I'm going to go ahead and run the poll and we'll get your thoughts on this proposal. So again, the question is, with 3-boat service on the Triangle route, not starting until early 2024, would you prefer to stick with the current 2-boat schedule? It's, you know how it works. Or add a scheduled unannounced 3rd boat when the crew and the vessel are available to supplement the 2-boat schedule, and that would help keep the boats stay on time. Adding that additional service could mean seeing sailings arrive and depart that are not on the printed schedule, watching the unscheduled boat leave the dock less than full, like it might load partially and then need to get out of the way for the scheduled boats to come in. Loading on an earlier sailing, but waiting offshore to allow one of the other scheduled boats to load or unload. Loading on an earlier sailing, but stopping at a different terminal than your destination, say going to Southworth and then Vashon. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to launch the poll, and we're really interested to hear your thoughts on this and what we can do until early 2024 when 3-boat service is restored. It looks like some folks are thinking. I'm seeing the numbers tick up and down. 65 people have voted. Give those of you who haven't yet just another minute if you want to select your choice. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you so that Steve and John and everyone else, their teams, can see the results. So it looks like the vast majority, 88%, prefer the proposal to add a third unscheduled and unannounced boat, and about 12% would prefer to stick with the current 2-boat schedule. I'm going to leave that up for a few minutes so everyone can see those numbers. 88% prefer the third unscheduled unannounced boat, 12% prefer 2-boat service. I'm going to stop sharing that and then we will move into the rest of our meeting. So we can move to the next slide. So now's the time where we're going to begin taking your questions. You might have additional questions on this topic or some of the other topics that we presented earlier in the meeting. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera so you can see our panel members who are joining us on screen. And we're going to take your questions. As a reminder, those of you who joined us late, we're taking questions from the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question. I'll be reading those aloud. If you have a comment, that's more than welcome to just submit a comment. A number of you are doing that. We are reading those comments. We're going to compile them and share them with the executives on the screen and other ferry staff, but I'm not going to be reading them all out loud tonight. We'll just take the questions and try to get those questions answered in the time we have remaining in the meeting. So Patty, first question here, what with the delay in the return of the third boat to the Triangle route, this commenter is saying that the wait times and delays are becoming really unbearable. Is anything happening at the legislative level to get additional support for Washington State Ferries?
Thanks for that question. As was mentioned earlier, I mean, the legislature the last 2 years have been very generous to Washington State Ferries. They've been funding our workforce development programs. As I mentioned, there's a lot of new training programs that we've been able to put into place. They've also funded us for new boats. So that's been huge and we really appreciate that support. But as we've talked about, it just takes time to get folks through these programs so that they can get into those positions that we have, need to increase the numbers on. And of course, building new boats takes a long time as well. So my biggest thing would be to continue to reach out to your legislators and ask for continued support. They have a big job. They have to look at the whole state and balance how the funding gets spread around. But as John mentioned, the Ferry Caucus has been extremely vocal down in Olympia for the needs of the ferry system, and we really appreciate all of that great support.
Okay, thanks. And Patty, sort of on the same topic, can you just clarify, we had a couple questions. What state organization is Washington State Ferries accountable to? What department are we part of?
So Washington State Ferries is a division within the Washington State Department of Transportation, and we are a cabinet agency to the governor's office. So we are in frequent conversations with the governor's office on what's happening on the ferry system and what our needs are.
Okay, thanks, Todd. I'm going to combine a number of questions we're getting here that are asking how could Washington, we be asking for proposing fare increases on a route that is not yet seen full service restoration. And I could see there's a lot of frustration among meeting attendees about that. So did you consider any sort of only increasing fares on routes that have been fully restored, or in holding off on increasing fares until routes like the Triangle route are fully back to their full service levels?
Thanks, Hadley. Thanks for that question. Yes, that was part of the discussion when we were looking at this. As I mentioned, we discussed internally what options we could present to this group. We landed on 2 of the options, and then when we talked to the Ferry Advisory Committee on tariffs, we landed on the third. And I think at all the junctures that we talked about, even with the Ferry Advisory Committee on tariffs, that option was presented and then agreed that we shouldn't bring that forward with that external group that we have. I know it's a tough message. It's a tough time to raise fares right now, but the legislature is very supportive of the ferry system and set that target for $419 million and a 4% fare increase. And that is so that we can sustainably restore service. As Patty mentioned and Steve talked to, the programs require funding so that we can grow people into these positions, so that we can preserve and maintain our aging fleet and our boats, so that we can replace boats. All of this kind of takes money. Some of that's on the capital side, some is on the operating side. I blended that discussion there, sorry. But with regard to operations, it takes funding to implement these programs, and we're thankful the legislature got us there so that we can sustainably restore service. I know it's a painful message, but it's necessary to get us there.
Okay, Todd, while your mic's on, another question for you. What percentage of the fees, the fares, cover the operating budget and the capital budget?
Sure. We call that fare box recovery. It's typically on the operating side is where we usually do that calculation. I'll give 2 points there. Pre-COVID, we operated at right around 72 to 78%, depending on the year. This proposal lands us right around the 58% fare box recovery mark. And it's right in line with where we've been during COVID, was right around the mid 50s. So fare box recovery would be 58% for this proposal.
And
Okay.
Todd, can I just add quickly to that, because the capital part, I believe nearly 100% of capital costs are paid for by the taxpayers of Washington, not fare box recovery. So our $200 million plus vessels, our terminals, the maintenance and preservation on those vessels, those are paid for by Washingtonians across the state. As Todd was saying, the fare box recovery is just that percentage of our operating costs. If you look, you'll see that you do pay a little bit of a new vessel surcharge. So some of that is paid for by riders, but the vast majority is paid for by the state's taxpayers.
Thank you, John. Yes, correct.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, Nicole, what is the target date, do you believe, for reaching some of those staffing levels that Patty showed on her screen, the target staffing levels?
Sure. As Patty mentioned, right now, the biggest constraint is our licensed deck officers. She briefly went through the programs that we're running now to get those numbers up. Right now, our folks, we have I think 19 people in the pilotage program. So those folks will go directly, when they're completed, into the new mate orientation that we're holding this fall. So we can expect, when that new mate orientation is over at the beginning of winter service, that we'll have the licensed deck officers we need to restore Vashon and Bremerton.
Okay, and we'll keep going on staffing for a minute, Nicole. Is there any incentive being offered to prospective new hires?
Right now, we're not offering incentives, and to be honest, we're having good luck getting new employees in the door. Our entry-level employees, we're filling those up. They don't require much in terms of previous experience. But as I mentioned, our real challenge is in the licensed realm. Steve and his group have successfully received some funding this next biennium, starting July 1, to bring licensed officers from outside of the agency and plug them into our pilotage program. So we should be able to continue to grow our licensed deck officers in that way too.
Okay, and one more question about hiring and staffing. Is WSF planning to hire back the employees that left due to the governor's vaccine mandate now that that mandate's been lifted? Would that help with the staffing shortage?
Right, so the mandate has been lifted. We actually didn't lose a lot of licensed deck officers because of the mandate. So I don't really anticipate we'll get licensed officers back, but I believe we have hired one in the unlicensed realm already. All are welcome. The vaccine mandate is over, and we're eagerly hiring back.
Okay, thanks. Steve, shifting over to you. What is the process for finding a replacement when a crew member doesn't show up for work? How does that happen?
It depends on which rank the crew member holds. We've got dispatchers they are the folks that are making calls all day, every day to fill open jobs. If a crew member no shows in the morning, then the boat is kind of not able to sail until they can find someone to replace them. So they immediately start making calls, trying to find someone. If a crew member doesn't show up for like the afternoon shift, because the vessel's operating, most of the times crew members volunteer to stay, keep the vessel sailing until another crew member can be located. But to get really into the weeds on how it's actually done would probably take a couple of hours. But that's the basics of how it works.
Okay, and Steve, do you have any, another question here, do you have any data on the retention rate of trained licensed deck officers?
But I think our attrition is generally we count in our planning as we lose one licensed deck officer a month. I mean, our training programs only just stood up in September, so we haven't lost anybody that we've trained. So it's too, if you're asking about the new training programs, it's too soon to kind of get that data. If you're asking about already qualified long-standing deck officers, we account for about 12 a year, leaving through retirement or finding other work.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Patty, why should customers be concerned about the lack of boats? Why is that important to them? And do you have, is this something that was sort of new or a surprise to Washington State Ferries that got to the situation we're in now?
Sure. Yeah, the concern about lack of having boats is because when one breaks down, we don't have another one to bring in. Sorry about the glare. I can't avoid the glare there. And that's critical. I mean, as John mentioned, we used to have 24 vessels, so we had a lot more that were on standby to fill in when necessary, and we've lost that. Did we see this coming? Yes. Prior to the pandemic, Washington State Ferries has been asking for funding to help maintain our existing fleet better, as well as knowing that we had this aging fleet that we needed new vessels. We also knew that we had the silver tsunami coming and we needed to increase our training program. Unfortunately, the legislature great to see in the last couple sessions that they finally have seen that these are real issues and it's a real problem. And unfortunately, it's affected all of us. It's affected you as the customers, most importantly. And so we're just working through trying to build things back and hopefully be in a place where we don't get here again, you know, that we have these programs, that we keep the funding, because we got to think long term about this. It's important that our boats are in good condition and can survive their longevity that they're planned for, as well as we need to ensure that we're growing our staff. Thanks.
Thank you, David. We have a couple questions about the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal project. Do both of the alternatives that you discussed include 2 slips?
No, but I think the thinking is that whatever alternative we do build, we would have the capability to add a second slip at some point in the future. It's not part of the base concept, though.
Okay, and then also about the project, what kind of traffic control or intersection improvements are being considered?
Well, for those of you that use the route, obviously, you know that intersection doesn't function very well, particularly at peak times with heavy traffic. You sometimes have folks in the right-hand lane trying to turn left, and it was recently striped so that we're trying to eliminate that. The left lane is left turns and the right lane is right turns. That's something that we're paying very close attention to in this study. We really want to correct the deficiencies there. It's as John said, and for safety is our #1 priority, and I personally witnessed incidents at that intersection, and I think that's one of our highest priorities at with the overall project is to improve how that intersection functions, whether that's a signal or it's additional lanes or what it looks like. We haven't determined that yet, but it's definitely a priority for us.
Okay, thanks, Todd. To fare increases. When there's a fare increase, where do those additional funds go and how do they help reach the long-term goals of the ferry system?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. These are typically identified through the legislative process. As I mentioned, the legislature typically sets the target. Historically, it's roughly been 2.5%. There's been higher increases in years past. This one is 4% for each of the 2 years. Those funds typically go to operate the system. In this particular area, like I mentioned before, they're going to program so we can sustainably restore service, where we grow and develop licensed deck officers, create pipelines for engine room employees. Of course, we can't discount the cost of fuel, right? We're constantly chasing what fuel does to our budget. We do have a fairly good hedging program where we can get budget stability there, but fuel often is pretty high there. So it typically goes to that purpose in order so that we can operate this service when these fare increases occur.
Okay, another question, Todd, for you related to fares. Why did we stop charging children under the age of 19? The commenter here is saying if we need the funds, should we reinstitute those fares for youth?
Absolutely. That came out of the legislative session. I believe it was last year. It was a legislative policy that came not just affecting ferries, but across the board for transit operators. It affected public transportation as well, and others that are doing that. So we don't really have a why. It came out of the legislative policy process. The governor supported it, and it frankly has been doing well for that population group. So that's, yeah.
Okay, Todd, another question. Did WSF consider, or did the legislature, when they set their targets, consider the reduced fuel costs and personnel costs due to the COVID-19 pandemic? And was part of the analysis that there's reduced service on Port Townsend, Bremerton, and the Vashon routes?
Thanks for that question. It's often confusing. You would think that with reduced service and we would have savings in this area. It just doesn't pencil out, as like I mentioned before. What also occurred during the pandemic is we've seen fuel prices skyrocket. They've been very high, and we've not been immune to those fuel prices. And of course, when we have reduced crewing, as the dispatchers and Steve's amazing crew gets called out, there's overtime that's incurred. So we're paying, our overtime percentages are typically higher in this particular area. So that really reduces, if not takes away, any particular savings that we might see in this type of an environment.
Okay, thank you. So this question, I guess, Patty, you could start with this. Have you considered coordinating with King County Metro to add more water taxi options from Vashon to downtown Seattle while they're on a 2-boat schedule?
We have not, and I appreciate the suggestion to do that. That's certainly something we can reach out to King County about and see kind of what the opportunities look like. So thanks for offering that.
Okay, thanks, John. We have a question about the route prioritization that you talked about as part of the service restoration plan. Why, with Bainbridge Island has a bridge and Whidbey Island has a bridge, why were they given higher priorities for service restoration?
That ridership level is key, and I in no way want to understate the frustration that you all have getting on and off the island in the morning and the afternoon. But those are the real pinch points during those busy commute times. But the other, when you talk about Bainbridge or Clinton Mukilteo, they are two of our busiest, they are our two busiest ridership routes for vehicles. So just having, if we restored routes before them, there would be hours-long lines. And again, not to understate how frustrating it is when you're in line in the evening, but there are hundreds of cars going to those terminals every hour, and just to keep things moving, we prioritize them in that way.
Okay, thanks, John. Patty or John, is WSF talking with members of Congress about changing the law so that WSF is able to hire internationally?
Well,
John, you mentioned that we can only hire American citizens.
We haven't talked to Congress about that, but I'll note, I think John mentioned it in his remarks. This is an international problem, having a shortage of mariners. So even if we had the ability to hire them directly from another country, like BC Ferries, they're struggling to find people as well. So I'm not sure that that solves the problem. I think a lot of, as we've mentioned, it's about growing folks within our system. We've got a lot of great programs. And as I've talked with folks that are just entering in, as the entry level, they know about these programs, they're excited about these programs, and that's why they're coming to join us. So I think this is a good place for us to really tackle it at the moment. John, I don't know if you want to add.
I would just add the Jones Act is 100 years old. I think it was passed in 1920. It's a federal maritime law aimed at making sure America has a robust maritime industry. In addition to those crewing requirements, they also require that the vast majority of boats that serve in the United States are built in the United States. So as you know, we get really good coordination with Senators Murray and Cantwell and the representatives from around the area, and they're often asking how they can help. But I think changing such an important law that has constituencies all over the country would be a very heavy lift.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit. This is on the topic of coordinating with transit. Patty, have you talked with Kitsap Transit about how the third boat might disrupt fast ferry operations? I guess that would be Steve or Patty.
Yeah, I'm not aware that we've started those conversations. We really wanted to hear from you to hear what your preferences were before we took it to the next step. So definitely we'll be coordinating with Kitsap.
Okay. John, can you talk a little bit? We still have a number of questions about the timeliness of customer notifications of delayed or canceled sailings. And would it be possible to get those notifications sooner or get them pushed directly to folks to their phones?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And the group you're looking at, as well as our colleagues, we talk about this all the time, that for the reasons we've explained, the legislature sets the amount of money we can spend on crewing. They set the amount of staffing that we can have. And so they've been great, and they're helping us build back. And we don't have control over how long that'll take to get everyone. We have the programs, but it's up to a lot of individuals when they retire or when they take the classes. The one thing that we can control is communicating with you, our customers, so that you can do things, so you can plan accordingly. I'll use yesterday morning on Point Defiance Tahlequah as an example. That yesterday morning, we are funded by the legislature to run the level of service that you see. So at the beginning of every season, we bid those to our employees. Every boat and every sailing is crewed. But as I said earlier, if someone has a flat tire on the way to work, if they have a sick child, or they're sick when they wake up, or sometimes there's just regular human confusion of not knowing which terminal they're supposed to be at, or there was a day that they were supposed to be working. When that happens, we don't know until either just before or actually when the boat is ready to sail and there's someone not there. And we cannot sail without that Coast Guard required crewing. So we have a web agent on duty from 4:30 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. And then the watch supervisor on Steve's team from 10:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. They message out things that are auto tweeted. So we do our best to keep you apprised of what's happening. But when there's those last minute relief requests, we don't have the notice, let alone giving it to you. But that doesn't mean it's not a priority. We know you need that information, and trying to get, I talk to people all the time when a few months ago when we were tying up the Point Defiance Tahlequah boat more often, who, were trying to race to the north end or just having to frequently explain to their bosses why they were late. And, we understand jobs are tight and that, supervisors get frustrated with those reasons. So it's something we're working on. We do our best, but the web agent and the watch supervisors are looking at a whole system. So, they get it out to you as quickly as they can, but at the same time that's happening, we might have a boat out in the San Juans and they're juggling all those notifications at the same time. But please know we understand it's important and we're doing our best.
Okay, John, while your mic is on, has WSF ever considered having a resident-only line so that residents of Vashon don't have to wait 3 hours to get home from work?
We get this question a lot, not just from your route, but from other routes. The San Juan Islands talks about this a lot. We are, as you know, part of the state highway system. And as such, we have to grant passage on a first come, first served basis. So, it is complicated because there might be people who have a house on Vashon who live in Yakima and are going there for the weekend, or they just own property and they're going. So we would have to set up a whole system for deciding who is and who isn't a resident, or put that onus on our toll booth operators, which would be totally unfair and would obviously cause lines. We've actually taken this to the Attorney General's office because it came up so much and we understand your frustration. And the AG's office has given us an opinion that we have to accept traffic on a first come, first served basis. I remember before we did the triangle schedule reroute, when we were able to have a traffic officer at Fauntleroy, we would often pull people out of line to get them through to their boat. And that was an exception simply because we were trying to fill a Vashon boat and we had 20 Southworth cars between Vashon customers, but that's the only exception. Those Southworth people in between were going to get on the next Southworth boat. So, something we've considered, but we aren't able to do.
Dave, can you just clarify? We have a question here. You're considering expanding the Fauntleroy ferry terminal by how many vehicles? What's the range that you're considering?
Yeah, so the base right now is about 84 cars. The options to expand per our terminal design manual could be as high as 186 cars. There's a 124 car version and 155 car version that we're looking at. So it's a whole kind of scope of different sizes that have different advantages and of course disadvantages in terms of cost and overwater coverage and environmental impact. So yeah, there's a range within that second option of different sizes, all the way up to basically a dock that holds one and a half times the vessel capacity.
Okay, thanks. And Dave, on the topic of the project, are you considering good-to-go technology to help relieve some of the congestion on the Fauntleroy dock?
Yeah, so we actually had a meeting on that today with the project team. We've got a consultant that's worked on the tolling initiative throughout the metropolitan area. Good to Go is been around for a while. Patty Rupstello, our assistant secretary, guided that program in its infancy. So we're looking at that as an option, as a way to improve throughput, and there's a number of ways to do it. We're looking, we've got options, a range of options, and there's also policy things that would have to change too if we implemented those, in terms of not having, for example, not having somebody to count the number of passengers that are paying for that particular route. Is one of those limitations, and Good to Go doesn't quite do that for us yet. So we're looking at the technology. It's something that we're studying, and it's part of this planning and environmental process that we're in right now. And we hope to update the community on some of those things that we're learning in the coming months.
Okay, Dave, sticking with the topic of Fauntleroy ferry terminal replacement and construction, we have a couple questions here. During construction of the new dock, how would ferry service be affected? And what would happen with service? Would it be diverted to downtown Seattle or some other place? Have you considered that yet?
Well, we haven't gotten into the details yet. We're still very early in the process. I will say that when we replaced a lot of the terminal building and the facilities at Coleman Dock, our number one priority was to maintain the service as best we could during the construction of that facility. And I think we've done a pretty good job having the contractors coexist with the riders. The footprint at Fauntleroy, as you know, is much narrower and will be more challenging to do that. The idea that this person suggests is certainly on the table. Maybe not every sailing, but maybe a few sailings could be diverted downtown. Again, it comes back to what boats we have available and what crew we have available. As you all know, a sailing from Vashon to downtown Seattle would take significantly longer than a sailing from Vashon to Fauntleroy, so there would be a loss of service, but it may be necessary depending on the alternative we select and how we sequence the staging of building the new dock.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So we're nearing the end of our meeting time. We still have a number of questions. I don't think I'm going to get to all of them, but I'll take a few more that are already in the Q&A box. So the next one, Patty, did the bill that was in the legislature to build ferries outside of the state of Washington, did that get approved?
Yes, yeah, it did get approved. So for those not familiar, prior to this legislative session, our vessels, any new build vessels had to be built within Washington state. But the legislature did pass a bill that gives us the ability to contract with another shipbuilder that's outside of Washington state, so anybody within the United States. And it also gives us ability to contract with multiple providers. So we think this is good from the standpoint that we think we'll get more vessels faster. They did also put a kind of a bonus point to local shipbuilders. So for those who are bidding on the project that are within Washington state, they do get a bit of a bonus in that procurement process, which is good for having jobs and good for our economy. So thanks for that question.
Okay, thanks, Patty. Just trying to scroll through the questions and see which ones we have not addressed. Steve, this one is, I think, a good one for you. Has WSF considered working with the Navy or the Coast Guard to recruit folks coming out of the military to come work at Washington State Ferries?
Yeah, the issue is that officers in the Navy and the Coast Guard don't have the US Coast Guard credentials for maritime vessels. The programs that we talked about, the three programs that we've implemented, will greatly assist anybody that wants to come from the military into WSF and work their way up to the pilot house. They would be able to enter through those programs. But it's not a direct translation. If you're qualified in the Navy, you're not directly qualified to drive an oil tanker or a cruise ship or a ferry. It's not a one-for-one qualification.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Dave, what are the plans for the Southworth Ferry Terminal?
Yeah, so we have money that the legislature's provided for replacement of the facility. There's a number of phases that we intend to roll out, but we're just in that initial sort of scoping and permitting phase at the moment. We haven't even started any community outreach. We're really just trying to grasp what we need to do there. But the key elements are to replace the trestle. It's similar to Fauntleroy. And Vashon before it. It's an old timber trestle. It's seismically deficient, and while it's in better condition than Fauntleroy in terms of the timber, it is subject to shaking and disturbance if there was a big earthquake. So we want to replace the trestle. The terminal building is something we also want to replace, and we're looking at bringing that on shore. We have an electrification program that Patty mentioned earlier that would electrify the route, the triangle route, and so that's, while it's out a few years, that's something else that we're looking at, is to bring those utilities in. So there's a whole host of projects within that Southworth program that we're just getting started with, and we're working closely with Kitsap Transit to get that environmental phase started.
Okay, great. So Patty, what is the best way to stay informed and up to date on all of these topics? Some of the commenters are saying they really appreciate all this information, but that it's still a really frustrating situation. So what's your direction to folks to find out what's happening?
Yeah, definitely go to our website. We post our every 2 weeks an update on service restoration. So that's where you're going to see the latest as far as how we're doing on hiring and where we're at in restoring different vessels to different routes. We also have a newsletter, so hopefully you can get hooked up on that. That's a weekly newsletter that gives you a lot of information and stories about what's happening in the fleet. That's another great avenue as well. But you can always reach out to us. And later I'll be sharing with you an email address. Hadley shared it at the beginning, but that's a great way you can reach out and ask for information as well.
Okay, thanks. So to sort of sum up, John, we have a few questions here that I think it's a good way to close, just to reiterate what you talked about earlier in the presentation. You mentioned that it's likely that 3-boat service will be restored in early 2024. Can people rely on that time frame? We have a few comments here saying that they want to make plans for working from home or talking to their employers about not commuting every day if we're going to be on 2-boat service, and some other comments about needing to kind of plan for what's coming next. So if you could just talk about that a little bit. Is the 2024 deadline fixed, and is that something people can plan around?
So, for all the reasons we've talked about, I'm loath to make a commitment, because every time we make a commitment, because of the fluidity, as I said, we have instituted, thanks to the governor and the legislature, the programs we need to build the crewing back. As Patty said, we've been talking to elected officials for a long time about the coming silver tsunami. In February, we thought we'd have the crewing to do this in April, May. Now, looking at the way people have moved through the system, we are fairly confident that at the beginning of the year, with the winter schedule, with that class graduating licensed deck officers at the end of the year, that we will be able to trial 3-boat restored service. So, we will do it as soon as we possibly can. We don't see why, given that class graduating, we wouldn't be able to restore service. We still have the vessel availability issue that Patty talked about, that we need to have that 3rd vessel, but we will be absolutely focused on getting you that route restored. But I don't want to make a commitment, because I know you all have been through kind of a roller coaster of 2-boat service over the last couple of years. And, we will do it as soon as we possibly can. And as of the 7th of June, we believe that will be very early next year.
And maybe I can add, because this was something I was going to share at the end of this meeting. We do plan to have another public meeting the first of the year. So that's going to be another great time to get the latest on where we're at with the number of crew that we've been able to bring on. So I think that will be very timely to seeing how the early part of next year looks.
Okay, thanks. So we are out of time for tonight. Thank you all very much for participating, for all the great comments and questions. And I know I didn't get to all the questions or comments, but we were all reading them. We'll be sharing them with other staff. I know the transportation commissioners and staff were reading a lot of your thoughts, and we'll be sharing them afterwards. So thank you for all the feedback, and Patty's going to have a few closing remarks.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just hope everyone thanks Hadley for moderating tonight's meeting. This is her 6th one that she's done in the last couple weeks. She does a great job of really combing through all the questions. You had a lot of questions this evening, and she made sure that she was hitting all the topics. And so thank you, Hadley, as well as the team that's behind the technology. We really appreciate the ability to come and have these meetings where you're at. And I think it's a valuable tool that we have. I want to thank my staff, but most importantly, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I hope that you found some of the information helpful. I know it didn't satisfy all of you. I know these are tough issues, and the service is a real struggle. And we understand that, but we appreciate your feedback and hearing your comments and suggestions. So again, thank you for joining us. The video again will be posted. I also, as mentioned on the screen here, is the list of all the Ferry Advisory chairs. So if you find yours and reach out to them, they're a great resource and they can share your concerns as well. As I mentioned, we hold these meetings twice a year, so we do plan to have another one the first of the year. So you'll get the latest and greatest at that time. The email address to, if you have further questions or comments or suggestions, feel free to email us at wsfcomms@wsdot.wa.gov. And again, you can also reach out to our customer service center. They're also a wealth of information and can help you out there as well. Now, when the meeting ends, you'll have an opportunity to take a brief demographic survey to help us improve our community engagement efforts and compliance with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You'll be asked to voluntarily provide us information about your race, ethnicity, and or gender. You're not required to disclose this information, but it really does help us make sure these meetings are meaningful for everyone. So if you can take the time to do that, we really appreciate it. So stay safe, enjoy the sunshine, and thank you again for participating. Have a great evening.